The cold, sharp wind bent the low vegetation around the campsite. Adam looked around, a slight smile on his face, as he took in the familiar faces of his longtime friends. Here they were, finally back together again, in a place that would test each of them to the limit. Sarah, the most athletic of the group, was adjusting her backpack, double-checking the climbing gear. Jake and Emily were side by side, tying their boots and checking the ropes they had brought along. Peter, the quietest and most introspective of them all, was absorbed in a map, murmuring softly as he traced the routes they had planned with his finger. They had dreamed of this climb for months. This summer, they had a one-time opportunity to conquer Mount Arctos, one of the most challenging peaks in the region. Known for its beauty as much as for its unpredictability, Arctos was a popular destination for seasoned climbers, but it also carried a reputation for fatal accidents and mysterious disappearances. To Adam and his friends, this added to the allure. They considered themselves ready, determined to face whatever the mountain threw at them. Still, as he looked up at the summit shrouded in dark clouds, Adam couldn't shake an unsettling feeling, as if something about the mountain was different that morning. The journey began quietly, each one lost in their own thoughts. The climb started smoothly, with steady steps and the sound of ropes dragging against the rock. The laughter became sparse as they ascended, replaced by the dense silence of the mountain. The beauty of the rocky slopes contrasted with the hostile environment, and the biting wind seemed to whisper warnings that they ignored, distracted by the thrill of the adventure. Further up, Sarah noticed something out of place, worn-out climbing gear scattered along the trail. Rusty carabiners and pieces of frayed rope, as if someone had abandoned them there. Adam approached, picked up a carabiner, and felt the cold, rusty metal in his hands. He exchanged a look with Jake, who frowned, puzzled. The group exchanged silent glances, each one pondering what it meant. No one needed to say anything. The mystery of that gear was palpable, as if Mount Arctos bore the marks of souls that hadn't made it down. The discovery added tension, and the group continued forward, now with doubled caution. Their backpacks felt heavier, and the thin air intensified their fatigue. Each step was taken with a mix of respect and distrust. The trail narrowed, and the clouds on the horizon grew darker. Adam looked back and met Emily's gaze, who just nodded, trying to hide her apprehension. The mountain, which had once seemed majestic, now revealed a menacing face, a warning that they weren't welcome. At one point, they stopped for a quick break on a small plateau. Jake took a canteen from his backpack, passing it to Sarah, who took a sip while keeping a vigilant eye on the surroundings. Peter went over the map again, murmuring to himself, as if seeking confirmation they were still on track. Arctos isn't for the weak, he muttered, more to himself but loud enough for the others to hear. The words hung in the air as they all tried to catch their breath. It was only the beginning, and they knew things would get harder from here. As they resumed the climb, the trail became increasingly treacherous. The loose stone ground slipped beneath their feet, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of an imminent storm. Sarah, who led the group, frequently looked at the sky, concerned. Adam felt the weight of tension on his shoulders but avoided looking back, fearing his friends might notice the uncertainty on his face. "It's fine, we just need to keep going," he repeated to himself, trying to push away the fear that was starting to take root in his mind. As they climbed higher, the sense of unease only grew. With each step, Adam felt like the mountain was resisting their presence, as if it was forcing them to turn back. The rocky slopes seemed to close in around them, limiting their view of what lay ahead. Mount Arctos was becoming a true labyrinth, full of hidden dangers, as if it wanted to prove that not everyone was ready to face it. They were far from home, in a territory where any mistake could be fatal. As they continued, Adam realized they were entering a narrower part of the trail, where they could only move single file. The clouds on the horizon now merged into a dark, threatening gray, signaling that the storm wouldn't take long to descend upon them. Each step felt like a calculated risk, each rock a potential trap. Emily, right behind Adam, tripped on a loose rock and clung to the cliff wall, gasping. He turned quickly to support her, their eyes meeting with fear. At that moment, the reality of the imminent danger seemed to intensify. Adam forced himself to look away and move forward again, still holding on to Emily as she regained her balance. Doubts began to creep in, echoing in each of their minds. Had they underestimated Mount Arctos? What if they weren't prepared enough? The dense silence around them, broken only by the sound of the wind, seemed to give a clear answer, but no one dared to speak aloud what they truly felt. The path ahead was long, and the summit seemed further away than ever, hidden by the heavy clouds that hinted at a night full of uncertainties. As the sun disappeared behind the clouds, the group continued their climb in silence. Fatigue was starting to set in, and each of them focused on their steps, their breathing, and on keeping their balance. The landscape around them became increasingly barren and hostile. The trees thinned out, giving way to sharp, gray rocks, some jagged like knives. Adam looked around, the harsh scenery reflecting the growing concern in his eyes. They were leaving the safety of solid ground behind, and the narrow trail made each step feel like a risky gamble. As they climbed, Jake was the first to notice a change in the wind. The cold breeze, which had earlier wrapped around them softly, now began to blow more fiercely, biting at their faces and adding to their discomfort. Jake glanced up at the sky and saw the clouds closing in, as if an invisible force were drawing them over the mountain's peak. He shot a warning look at Adam, who nodded, signaling that he, too, sensed the looming danger. The weather forecast hadn't mentioned storms, but Mount Arctos seemed to have its own agenda. Without stopping, Adam picked up the pace, trying to gain ground before the weather turned. With each step, the loose rocks shifted beneath his feet, and he struggled to maintain his balance. The others followed behind, each in silence, focused on maintaining concentration. The thin air made it harder to breathe, and the exhaustion weighed down on their shoulders like an invisible burden. The growing sense of insecurity was palpable, but no one dared to voice it aloud. Only the sound of their footsteps echoed through the canyon, a silent warning. When they turned a tighter corner on the trail, Sarah, who was walking ahead, stumbled. She slid down a few feet before grabbing onto a protruding rock, her face pale and breathing heavily. Emily hurried over to help her up, worry in her eyes. The incident made everyone pause for a moment, the silence weighing down on them. Each of them seemed to feel the mountain in a different way, as if it were alive and reacting to their presence. Peter, constantly looking around, seemed particularly affected. There was something in his expression that betrayed a growing tension. "Let's go, it's just a little further," Adam muttered, trying to dispel the discomfort, but even his own voice sounded strange in the silence. The others followed him, reluctantly, and resumed the climb. The storm, which had seemed distant, was now quickly approaching. Lightning flashed in the distance, and the sound of thunder began to echo off the slopes, a distant threat. With each step, the pressure mounted, as if Mount Arctos were trying to drive them away. The air grew denser, and the feeling that something was wrong hung over them like a shadow that refused to leave. As they approached a new plateau, they realized that the path ahead was becoming steeper and more treacherous. Adam signaled for everyone to stop and gather. He looked at Peter, who held the map, and they quickly discussed the best route. The safer path seemed to be closing in, as if the mountain were reshaping itself to block their passage. Jake suggested they take an alternative route, but it involved climbing up a nearly vertical rock wall. "We could shorten the way, but it's going to be risky," he said, with a look that showed even he doubted the idea. Silence followed, and they exchanged glances, weighing their options. As they debated, a sudden gust of cold wind enveloped them, almost knocking Emily off her feet. She grabbed onto a rock and looked around, as if expecting to see something hidden in the shadows. The feeling that they were being watched returned, stronger than ever, and a shiver ran down each of their spines. The tension was tangible, and they all wondered if Mount Arctos would let them pass or if they had made a grave mistake by attempting to conquer it. "We need to keep going," Adam said firmly, though there was a hesitation he couldn't hide. He was determined to reach the top, but he knew that every wrong move could cost them dearly. With no other options, the group decided to follow the safer route despite the apparent risks. As they climbed, the conditions worsened. The sky darkened, and the thunder grew louder and closer. Shadows from the clouds stretched over the slope, and the sense of impending danger made the air feel heavier. Sarah, still leading, began breathing erratically, and Adam noticed she was struggling to keep calm. "It's okay, we'll make it," he said, though he, too, felt vulnerable. The mountains seemed to be watching each of them, as if waiting for a mistake that would lead to disaster. As they navigated a tight curve in the trail, the wind suddenly picked up, nearly knocking Adam off his feet. At that moment, Lucas, who was slightly ahead, lost his footing. He turned abruptly, trying to grab hold of something, but the rock he clung to gave way. In a split second, he disappeared from sight, falling down the slope. The sound of Lucas's fall echoed across the mountain, followed by Sarah's stifled scream. Adam and Jake rushed to where he had fallen, their hearts racing and adrenaline taking over. When they reached the spot, they saw Lucas dangling in a narrow crevice, held only by his safety rope, his hands clawed into the rock face. His face was pale, and he was breathing heavily. "Hold on tight, we're coming for you," Adam yelled, trying to sound confident. Emily and Peter quickly set up an improvised rescue system with the spare ropes they carried. The group moved swiftly, but the tense silence among them showed they were all on edge. As they pulled Lucas back up, they noticed something alarming. The rope holding him had been partially cut, as if someone had tampered with it. Adam exchanged a worried glance with Jake but stayed focused on the rescue. There wasn't time for questions. Lucas was shaken and bruised, but fortunately conscious, though his eyes reflected the fear he felt. Once they had Lucas back on the trail, the group stopped to assess the situation. Sarah knelt beside Lucas, offering him water as the others tried to understand what had happened. Jake held the damaged rope, running his fingers over the jagged cut, and looked at Adam with a serious expression. "This doesn't look like wear and tear," he whispered, though everyone could hear him. The tension grew, and an uneasy silence settled over them. If someone had sabotaged the rope, it meant the threat was coming from within their own group. Or perhaps they weren't alone on the mountain after all. As Lucas regained his composure, the group debated their next move. Peter kept glancing around, as if expecting to see someone lurking among the rocks. "We have to keep going," Adam said, his voice filled with a determination he didn't feel. They all knew turning back wasn't an option, but going forward now seemed even more dangerous. Doubt crept into each of their minds, transforming the climb into a test not just of physical endurance, but of mutual trust. Adam felt a weight in his chest as he realized that alliances were beginning to fray. With no time for hesitation, the group resumed the climb, with Lucas leaning on Sarah and Emily for support. Their steps, once confident and assured, were now cautious and wary. The sky darkened further, and the temperature dropped quickly. The heavy clouds signaled that the storm was nearly upon them, and they knew they needed to find shelter before conditions worsened. Each of them was lost in thought, trying to process what had happened and what might still lie ahead. It was as if Mount Arctos were toying with them, manipulating their fears and forcing them to confront the vulnerability of being at nature's mercy. Time seemed to drag on as they followed the winding trail. Adam felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, and the possibility of sabotage made everything seem darker. He tried to keep the group together, but he knew the incident had left a deep scar on them all. Now, besides the mountain and the storm, there was the fear that something or someone was conspiring against them. The atmosphere of mistrust settled in, and everyone seemed more focused on their own steps and those of the others, as if each movement might reveal a hidden betrayal. Finally, they spotted a natural shelter, a small cave, and they rushed to take cover from the approaching storm. The wind roared, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, blending with the sound of thunder now echoing through the mountain. Huddled beneath the cave's rocky cover, the group tried to catch their breath. Adam looked at each of them, searching for any signs that something was wrong, but all he saw were exhausted and frightened faces. They were all on edge, but the true test was still to come. He knew the next few hours would be decisive and that Mount Arctos would not let them leave unscathed. The sound of rain pounding against the rocks enveloped the group as they huddled in their makeshift shelter. Sarah glanced around at the others, trying to read their expressions. The discovery of the cut rope had left a trail of unease that hung over them like a dark cloud. Adam was restless, casting nervous looks toward the shadows, as if he expected something or someone to suddenly appear. Amid the tense silence, Peter rummaged through his backpack, searching for the map. When he pulled it out, something else came with it, an old, grimy notebook with a tattered cover. They all stopped to look. "I found this earlier, when we saw that abandoned gear," he explained in a whisper. As he opened it, they saw pages filled with scribbled notes. Sarah leaned in to read, her eyes widening as she recognized the names of climbers who had disappeared on Mount Arctos over the years. The entries revealed more than they had expected. There were records of incomplete routes and hastily sketched maps, along with frantic notes about the mountain. "It seems like someone was trapped here and tried to find a way out," Emily commented, her voice shaking. The pages were filled with accounts of inexplicable phenomena, sudden shifts in weather, and paths that seemed to lead nowhere. There were mentions of something that inhabited the mountain, but the descriptions were vague, as if the writer couldn't find the words to express what they felt. Adam clutched the notebook tightly, trying to process the information. The notes seemed to describe exactly what they were going through, but something felt off, as if a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. "There's something on this mountain that makes it change constantly. This could be a coincidence, but maybe we're not alone here," he said, unsure if he believed his own words. The group exchanged nervous glances. Suddenly, Mount Arctos felt less like a mountain and more like a living trap. As they continued reading, Peter pointed to an entry that mentioned an alternate route, shorter but extremely dangerous. "If we take this path, we could avoid the more exposed areas of the storm," he suggested. But the notes warned of unknown risks and something the writer referred to as the guardian of the mountain. The words on those pages hinted at something beyond mere treacherous terrain. Emily quickly closed the notebook, as if its touch alone were a threat. "We need to decide what to do," she murmured, but her words seemed to be swallowed up by the sound of the wind and rain pounding on their shelter. The tension shifted into suspicion. Each of them looked at one another, pondering whether a traitor lurked among them. Adam felt the weight of responsibility, but also the fear that he was leading them into a situation he couldn't control. He wondered if everyone was really there for the adventure or if there was a hidden agenda. The silence grew unbearable, and even the storm seemed to amplify the pressure between them. No one wanted to admit it, but the idea that one of them could have sabotaged the rope or lured them into a trap was growing like a shadow. When the rain let up a bit, they decided to explore the area to see if there was another route. Sarah and Jake took the lead, with Adam and Peter following closely behind, while Emily stayed with Lucas, who was still recovering. As they walked along a narrow path that wound between two large rocks, Sarah pointed to strange marks on the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged. The markings seemed fresh and reinforced the notion that there was someone, or something, else on the mountain, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Back at the shelter, they regrouped and shared their findings. The decision to take the alternative route seemed inevitable. They were torn between facing the storm on the known path, with its dangers laid bare, or attempting the shortcut that promised even greater mysteries. Adam stood up and looked at the group, trying to muster courage. "I know we're all scared, but if we stay here, we won't make it. "We have to keep moving and find out what else this mountain is hiding," he declared, with more conviction than he actually felt. And so, the group prepared to resume the climb, knowing that Mount Arctos was far from conquered. The shadow of uncertainty continued to pursue them, and the feeling of being watched never left. They exchanged one last glance before setting out, and Adam realized that even if they reached the summit, something within them had already changed. The real challenge now wasn't just physical, but psychological, and each of them was about to confront their own demons. The wind blew cold and relentless as the group prepared to leave the shelter. Lucas was paler than usual, leaning heavily on Sarah for support. The weight of their decision from moments ago still hung over them. Taking the alternative route was a risk, but the thought of returning the way they came seemed equally dangerous. Mount Arctos, with its secrets and mysteries, seemed to have the power to manipulate their choices, and that left Adam feeling uneasy. They began the slow descent, carefully navigating the increasingly treacherous rocky terrain. The storm seemed to intensify, and the thick clouds made the sky look like an endless night. Jake, who had suggested the alternative route, led the group, studying each detail of the trail as they progressed. He paused frequently, observing the rocks and scanning the surroundings, as if trying to read some invisible sign of what lay ahead. With every step, the silence felt heavier, as though Mount Arctos was waiting for the right moment to strike. The progress was slow and exhausting, and the sense of impending danger never left them. Peter, ever observant, noticed something strange. The marks they had seen earlier suddenly vanished, as if they had been erased. He wondered if they were being led to a specific place, perhaps into a trap. Adam caught the worry in Peter's eyes and moved closer, attempting to reassure him, though he himself felt uncertainty with every step. It was as if the mountain was toying with them, leading them down paths that seemed to change right before their eyes. When they reached a narrow passage between two massive rocks, the group stopped. Lucas, still weak, needed to sit and catch his breath. Sarah knelt beside him, offering water and comforting words, but everyone knew he was reaching his limit. The tension grew almost unbearable as Peter suggested they leave Lucas behind. "We can't afford to be sentimental. If he can't keep up, he's putting us all at risk," he said, his voice low but resolute. His words echoed, and the silence that followed was as heavy as the thin air around them. Emily was the first to protest, her face marked by anger. "He's our friend. We're not leaving him behind," she murmured, throwing a defiant look at Peter. Adam tried to control the situation, but Peter's words had hit a sensitive nerve. They were all on the edge, physically and mentally, and the idea of abandoning someone no longer seemed as absurd given the risks they faced. The mountains seemed to feed on these thoughts, as if it were planting seeds of discord among them. In the end, they decided to continue with Lucas, but the atmosphere was now thick with resentment and distrust. The climb along the alternative path became more challenging with each passing step. The ground was slick, and the jagged rocks threatened their every movement. Sarah kept her head down, focusing on supporting Lucas, while Jake forged ahead, trying to guide the group. He had become an unlikely leader, though even he now seemed to doubt his own decisions. As they reached a wider crevice, the sight before them was chilling. A series of makeshift crosses stood planted in the ground, as if marking a grim memorial. Adam felt a shiver run down his spine, and Emily clutched his arm for support. "How many others have come this way?" she whispered, but no one answered. The crude, hastily carved crosses seemed to bear silent witness to other journeys that had ended in tragedy. Their presence, here on this alternative route, was a grim reminder that Mount Arctos did not tolerate weakness. After a brief pause, they moved on, now more apprehensive than ever. Feelings of fear and insecurity surrounded them like a fog, and each of them seemed lost in dark thoughts. Adam was now leading, though his hands shook slightly, something he tried to hide. He knew they needed to keep up hope, but the sight of the crosses and Lucas's weakened state made that almost impossible. The mountains seemed to be draining their strength, sapping their energy with every step deeper into the unknown. The group was in silence when they finally reached a clearing. The storm seemed to have quieted for a moment, as if Mount Arctos were granting them a pause. They all sat down, exhausted, and Jake pulled out the map, trying to make sense of where they were. "We're close, I think," he said, though his voice didn't sound very convincing. They knew there was still a long way ahead, and that any miscalculation could cost them dearly. They stared at the map as if it might offer the answers they needed, but they knew that the true destination lay beyond any lines drawn on paper. The sky grew darker and the cold wind that swept through the clearing seemed to announce that the storm's brief respite was nearly over. Lucas leaned heavily on Sarah, struggling to stay upright. Adam looked at his friend, knowing that if they didn't act soon, Lucas's chances of survival would diminish. But the path ahead was treacherous, and the exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Adam realized they were in a race against both time and the mountain itself. As Jake studied the map with Peter, Emily stayed close to Lucas, offering silent support. They exchanged glances, searching for some spark of hope amidst the desperation. Jake lifted his gaze and signaled to Adam, pointing out the direction. The final route would be steep and littered with loose rocks, requiring everyone's focus. Adam nodded, knowing there was no other choice. "Let's go," he said firmly, feeling the weight of responsibility. The group resumed the climb, moving slowly along the increasingly slippery trail. With each step, loose stones tumbled down the slope, disappearing into the darkness below. Sarah felt her heart race as her hands shook slightly, supporting Lucas. With every step he took, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen grew stronger, as if Mount Arctos itself were lying in wait to strike again. Suddenly, the sound of sliding rocks filled the air. Jake, who was leading, turned and shouted, but it was too late. Peter, trying to support Lucas, had stepped on a loose rock and lost his balance, falling backward toward the void. In a desperate attempt, Sarah reached out to grab him, but the rocks beneath her feet gave way. Peter clung to the edge, hanging over the abyss, as the others rushed to help him. His face was pale, and he fought to hold onto the swinging rope. Adam and Jake lunged to assist him, but before they could reach him, Peter made a decision. He looked up at Adam, his eyes filled with determination and sadness. "I can't hold all of you back. Go on without me," he murmured, his voice almost lost in the wind. Without warning, he let go of the rope and disappeared into the darkness, the sound of his body hitting the rocks below echoing through the mountain. The group froze, shocked, as Peter's sacrifice hung in the air like a shadow suffocating them. Time seemed to stand still as the group absorbed the loss. Sarah was in tears, and Jake, usually calm, appeared utterly lost. Emily covered her face, her sobs muffled by the wind. Adam felt a tightness in his chest, but he knew they couldn't stop. "Not now." In a hoarse voice, he gathered the remaining members. "We have to keep moving," he said, though his own words felt hollow. Peter's sacrifice had left a deep mark on them, but they had to go on, or it would all have been for nothing. Still in shock, they resumed the climb, now with a renewed sense of determination, as if Peter's loss had fueled them. The mountains seemed to be watching, each shadow hiding a secret. The wind whistled in their ears, and the heavy clouds threatened to unleash their fury at any moment. Lucas, now supported by Sarah and Emily, seemed distant, his eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead, as if he were lost in thoughts that no one else could understand. As they climbed, the trail narrowed further, forcing them into risky, precarious passages. The steep slopes and jagged rocks seemed ready to capture them, and each step required absolute concentration. Even with physical and emotional exhaustion weighing heavily on them, Adam led the group with fierce determination, refusing to let Peter's sacrifice be in vain. The silence between them was thick, as if each person were fighting their own internal battle, struggling to come to terms with what had just happened. At last, after what felt like hours of grueling, uphill struggle, they spotted a cave ahead. It was an improvised shelter, but it offered some refuge from the storm that threatened to engulf them. They entered the cave, feeling an immediate relief from the elements. Adam looked at each of them, seeing the fatigue and fear etched into their faces. He knew Peter's sacrifice had shaken them to the core, but it had also bonded them in ways they couldn't explain. Sitting in the cave, they remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The wind howled outside, and the storm raged, a reminder that Mount Arctos was still testing their limits. Adam scanned the group, searching for any comforting words, but nothing seemed adequate. The true challenge lay ahead, and somehow, they would have to face the mountain once more. The final leg of the journey awaited, and they all understood they would need to find strength they didn't know they had. The storm finally broke over the mountain, and the sound of thunder echoed through the cave where the group sheltered. The wind howled, penetrating the shelter and forcing everyone to huddle closer for warmth. Peter's sacrifice weighed heavily on their minds, casting a shadow of grief and fear over them. Adam knew that despite their temporary refuge, they needed to descend before the mountain claimed more from them. At dawn, the group decided it was time to resume their descent. Lucas, still supported by Sarah and Emily, seemed to be fighting off exhaustion and pain, but there was no room left for hesitation. Jake took the lead again, forcing himself to stay calm, though his steps betrayed the fatigue that gripped him. The rain continued, making the ground even more slippery, and each step was taken with extreme caution. The weight of Peter's loss seemed to follow them, a constant reminder of the fragility of life when confronted with nature's wrath. As they descended, the terrain became even more treacherous. The path seemed to shift, leading them into dead ends as if Mount Arctos were distorting their perception. Adam stopped for a moment, trying to find a reference point, but everything around them looked the same. The fear of being lost crept into their minds, and the disorientation left them more vulnerable. The sounds of wind and rain surrounded them, and Mount Arctos seemed to be watching, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Time lost all meaning, and the exhaustion only made everything feel more confusing. Adam felt he'd reached his limits, but he knew he had to keep going. Suddenly, he noticed something strange on the ground. Between the rocks, there were footprints, fresh footprints. He looked around, trying to see if there was anything else, but the rain blurred his vision. The presence of those prints intensified the feeling that they weren't alone, that someone had been watching them, or worse, following them. The group pressed forward with a mixture of hope and desperation. The footprints led them to a passage that, surprisingly, seemed to be a way down. Jake took the lead again, though the weight of doubt was evident in his hesitation. Were they really closer to getting out, or were they walking deeper into the trap that Mount Arctos had set? No one dared to speak, and the tense silence kept them focused on each step, as if any sound might trigger a new danger. Adam wondered if they would live to tell their tale. After hours of grueling descent, they finally saw what looked like the end of the trail. A sense of relief and disbelief washed over them, and Sarah let out a sigh that carried all the accumulated tension. The sight of trees in the distance signaled that they were near the base of the mountain. Adam's eyes filled with tears. He had never felt such overwhelming relief. They had survived. They were finally leaving Mount Arctos, but they knew that the mountain would be with them forever. Once they reached the base, they took a brief pause to catch their breath. Lucas, with difficulty, thanked everyone for their support. Peter's loss still weighed on them, but there was a mutual sense of gratitude for making it this far. As they prepared to return to civilization, Emily noticed something at the edge of the trail. A worn sign, with faded lettering, read, "The mountain takes what it's owed." They exchanged looks, understanding that in a way, Mount Arctos would always have a piece of them. Weeks later, Adam, now alone, revisited the notebook Peter had found on the mountain. The pages they hadn't read seemed even darker in light of what they had endured. One of the last entries from the previous climber described Mount Arctos as a guardian and an executioner, always waiting, always watching for new challengers. Adam closed the notebook with a shiver. He knew he'd never forget what they had experienced, and he wondered how many others would share their dark fate. Adam knew that he had been changed forever. They had survived, but at a cost they would never fully understand. He stood up, the notebook in his hands, and looked out toward the mountains on the horizon. Mount Arctos loomed in the distance, silent and imposing, as if it were watching him. He knew he would never climb that mountain again, but he also knew that he would never stop feeling its presence. The mountain was inside him now, a ghost that would never be exorcised.